Hi, everybody. My name is Saima Akhtar. I'm the Associate Director of the Computational Science Center at Barnard College. We work to lower the barrier of entry into computing for students across all disciplines, trying to create a new generation of responsible technologists. This panel is meant to discuss imagining positive digital spaces and building them. And so I thought I would start with just the basics, since this kind of concept of digital space is so vast and broad. I was wondering if each of you who come from such different backgrounds, if you could just describe how you see digital spaces as they currently exist and what makes a digital space. So Joy, do you want to start and then we can go down?
So at New Public, the way that we think about and talk about digital space is really specifically around digital public spaces. And the best way to kind of understand and visualize that is thinking about spaces in real life that are public. So if you think about and visualize parks and libraries and the way that those are utilized in real life, you can get an understanding of what digital spaces, digital public spaces are. So you have Twitter, which is a public space. It's a public forum where people go to interact, to get information. Think about the way that libraries are used. People access resources, people go for being able to get information from folks and being able to connect. And so that's the way that we like to think about and be able to visualize what the equivalent for public space is in real life and online.
I do a lot of work in the metaverse and VR and AR, and so much of it is so exciting because it's not controlled by big tech companies. I mean, they do invest in it, but a lot of the work has been exciting because it doesn't have this prescribed sort of constraint. You build from the ground up. And I think a lot of very diverse and interesting creators from very different backgrounds have made a body of work that is really inspiring for where the metaverse can be. And it's driven by narrative and storytelling and lived experience. So those are the types that I find most exciting. It's obviously not social media or any of those other places.
I think thinking very expensively of digital spaces, I almost feel like it's our life, right? Like as long as it's something that is tech supported or accessible through technology. I mean, think about like cameras at the store or, our phones, the metaverse. I mean, there's so many, it's sort of like every extent of our life has been digitalized to a certain extent at this point. And so it's really like everything that's around us. But I think when we think like more narrowly about that, I think it's really also like the digital version of our social spaces. So wherever people congregate, communicate, build memories, dream, build, etc. With I think the added twist that it's much more exposed to the rest of the world, right? And it's more accessible to the rest of the world because they tend to be existing at scale. And I think that's sort of like the difference between the regular social space that we have in our day-to-day life and the digital space.
Yeah, there's a really striking parallel in all of your answers between what we experience in everyday life and what then is kind of recreated in the virtual environments that we kind of interact with on a daily basis. And so just adding the descriptor positive, can you, each of you, give an example or a few examples of what constitutes a positive digital space? Yeah, so we'll just stop there.
Yeah, I'm happy to start there. I was thinking about this notion of positive, especially, so I work in trust and safety. Specifically, I work on policies, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand and define and identify words and like what's behind them. And so when I think about a positive space, it sort of like carries this notion of like optimism, right? And so that made me reflect a little bit on like my personal experience. And I think I'll put a bit of a trigger warning there because I'm going to talk about something a bit sensitive, but one of the most beneficial spaces I've been in was one for mothers of angel babies, right? And so it was actually a space that was filled with loss and tears and stories of pain. But that was a space that was very healthy because people were able to come there and be vulnerable and exchange emotions. And so I think that maybe instead of focusing on a positive space, I would like to focus on a healthy space, right? And I think that that's what it gets to, like building spaces where people can come and be themselves and be vulnerable to learn, to create, and to congregate around like common purpose. And of course, that takes a lot of intentionality in the way that we as technologists design those spaces so that they incorporate those principles of like safety, privacy by design, et cetera. And I think it's also takes some intentionality in the people who are organizing those spaces, right? So the people on the platform who are building communities and who are developing norms around them and allowing people to understand those norms and follow them.
Could not agree more. When we think about positive digital spaces and what that means, it's something we actually talk a lot about at New Public. And I kind of think about this in two buckets. There's one bucket where I think you can't have a positive digital space unless you also consider the kind of behavior of a company and an organization towards its users. So how is that organization using their users' data? Or are they being extractive towards users? That's one bucket. And I think the other thing to think about is also kind of to your point around design and intentional design of these spaces is incredibly important. And like I said, something that we think about a lot at New Public because we have a body of research called the Signals where we've distilled research from hundreds of practitioners and experts in this field and surveyed thousands of people who are hyper users on the internet to really understand what positive, healthy, productive digital spaces look like. And the answers that we got from that research were pretty consistent across all these different folks that we were talking to in the world. And what it really boils down to four key things. And that is that, these spaces are welcoming, people are invited in, they have norms that are established from the get-go. These spaces connect people, folks are able to interact with each other, and that's, what they're there for. These spaces are facilitating understanding so that people can, connect with each other across difference. And ultimately, if it's useful, they're able to act and take some kind of agency within that space. So all of those things are really important to actually characterize what people want from positive digital spaces. And as an example, an app that I use that I characterize as a piece of calm technology is called Somewhere Good. It's a really new app, and it's actually an audio app that it helps to facilitate really positive and intimate community conversations. And not only that, it's a company that expressly states its intention to not be extractive of its users and to cultivate positive environments. And so technology like that is it's wonderful, and it's not attention seeking. And when you go actually into the space just by opening it on your phone, it just feels good. So that's how I'd characterize positive spaces.
That's great. What was the name of that again? Somewhere Good. I think what is positive? Who defines it? Such big questions. To me, when I look at, I don't think virtual or I look at virtual kind of spaces, which are digital spaces. And I don't think virtual spaces should necessarily replicate physical spaces. I think they should have their own imagination and logic. But there is a lot of inspiration and maybe some humility when we think about urban planning and Jane Jacobs. I love New York because of Jane Jacobs. And we have to keep in mind when we build the metaverse or virtual spaces, we could have good intentions. We do want to build what we think is right. But if you look at urban planning, that's often been wrong. And it's often been people where there's some organic nature or there's something that's unexpected. I think, Jane Jacobs, you wouldn't have really thought anyone could have come up with that. And that idea is so intrinsic to making New York, have soul and character. So I think, for me, positive spaces have something that's, related to that kind of case study. And to give you some examples of what I like, that's fun, is I love an app called Arena, ARE.NA, because it just feels, again, a lot more transparent, and a lot more, less about manipulation and algorithm driven, and again, allows for something to happen that I think is really interesting and exciting, and has really interesting constraints on it as well. And then I really like how a lot of very young people are going back to Tumblr because they're sick and tired of Instagram and posing and marketing and everything. And I think that's, again, says something, that they want authenticity,
Well, I love that you brought up urban planning because I studied architecture, and just being between two disciplines, that I think about the built environment physically and virtual environments, just virtual, like just an environment that we can't see that sometimes replicates issues that we haven't yet quite resolved in our physical realm. And part of that is really accounting for the unintended, as you say. So we can have an app that intends to create kind of a healthful, positive experience for people, but then you can't account for the way that people use it, or kind of hack it, or find creative ways to get around the way that things are intended to be used. And so Twitter is an example of that, right? We think of Twitter as this square, this public square that can be helpful when it comes to organizing certain movements, but then it can have those kind of more negative consequences for people, because sometimes certain controls aren't accounted for. And so I just want to kind of dig into that a little bit more and get away from these like big questions. So I'll go back to you, Gabo, because I want to talk about your work in relationship to this. So if you aren't familiar with Gabo's work, I would really recommend checking it out. He uses film and VR technology to tackle difficult subjects through storytelling. And some of the subjects he's explored is the experience of a young Syrian refugee, a Holocaust survivor, people who are experiencing eviction, and so on. And so I just want to ask you, what about VR and digital space is central to your work? And what do you hope it achieves outside of traditional film and storytelling media? And what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of using this kind of media? So thinking about the expected and unexpected.
Yeah, I got started in this type of work in 2014, and when I started, I felt like nobody cared as much as they care now because of the metaverse and what's happening. And I think, a lot of my work is related because it's just kind of foreshadowing where everything is going to go, which is a lot more spatial, experiential, and a lot more with your senses. And right now we engage with the internet in a very limited way, in digital spaces in ways that are very, I think, 2D. But I think we're fast approaching a world where a lot of these design decisions and a lot of the problems even will be tenfold or 100-fold more difficult, because now there's going to be greater interface with our neurobiology in ways that are really can be very troubling, and if you look at Neuralink, or connecting your brain to interfaces and everything, it really literally makes you think when they ask what's on your mind. Do you remember that with Facebook, or what was on your mind? Now we will know. We know where you will look. We know how your heart will beat. We already know so much about you, and we'll know even more. So I think that's where it's very relevant. I think it's and I think it's a wonderful future, but I think if we don't solve these things, we might not even get that. I think it'll just, I think we're at an inflection point where I think the house can come tumbling down, you know, and there could be no progress in the way we want because we haven't figured out the policy, the privacy, the ethics, the philosophy, all those other things that I think have made most people feel really bad about what's happening, you know, which I understand. So that's how I think it's relevant.
Joy, I want to talk to you a little bit about your work too. It's also amazing work in the public and nonprofit sector. And previously you worked with the New York City Mayor's office and also in trying to increase the number of STEM educators. And so I was just wondering about your thoughts on civic engagement, public education, and infrastructure, and how that can help create more positive experiences for folks online.
Yeah, this is a tough question for me because I felt like coming from public service and from government was a natural transition into tech, because I really do see the tech sector as kind of an institution with just as much power and influence in our daily lives as government has. Like, I think about when, you know, WhatsApp went down. When was that? It could have been years ago. It could have been last week. I don't remember. But like, think about the way, the power and influence that these institutions and these companies have over our lives. It's like kind of a no-brainer how important they are in equivalent ways, and how they need to kind of be in conversation with each other. And I think it's come up and been really obvious when, you know, you talk to policymakers who really don't have the breadth and depth of experience in tech or understand what's going on, which can be really concerning. So I just, it feels very kind of visceral and urgent and important to me in ways that are really difficult to articulate, but I think almost obvious because we see the consequences every day.
Well, do you have hope in terms of the kinds of, just in terms of your work with policymakers? So it's clear when we watch hearings, right? When Mark Zuckerberg is being interviewed or whatever, under questioning, that like some of the questions aren't quite like informed, let's say. And so that's why I think it's really important to have some sort of digital literacy across all disciplines. And it's not just computer science, it's not just computing, it's in law, it's in public policy, it's in economics. And so I'm just wondering, what is your experience talking to people in terms of the kinds of controls or regulations that we can see going forward in terms of just creating general equity among people's experience and access to digital spaces?
Yeah, I think it's hope. I think it's really a combination of things that are necessary and important. And I, you know, not really talking to policymakers about this stuff, but obviously thinking about it really intensely, because there are, you know, at Barnard, I went to Barnard, by the way, we can talk about that later, but a lot of institutions at the higher education level have really invested in tech literacy, and not just that, but like engineering programs, making sure that STEM is at the forefront and at the future of education. But then all the grade levels below that, there's not really anything in the same way that we kind of ignore civic engagement in schools. And I think that conversations like the ones we're having today are really important to bring that to the forefront and really help to prioritize that. But you know, ultimately, I do have hope because we are seeing it at some level that people are really trying to understand. And there are also these movements to bring like other kinds of literacy, not just tech literacy, but incorporate the social sciences into tech, and make sure that folks have a really kind of robust and comprehensive understanding of the potential for unintended consequences when creating these technologies and platforms. So in that regard, I do have a lot of hope.
Yeah. Okay. And then switching gears slightly, Dona, you've worked on public policy, trust and safety with some of the world's most influential tech companies, from Google to Airbnb to now what we call Meta. So in your experience, what are some of the motivators for large tech companies to create safe spaces in the public's interest when those actions at time may work against those organizations' own best interests or bottom lines. So that's a big one, but
I'll try.
yeah.
I think I come from like an interesting part of these companies. And I know I have a few colleagues in the room in the trust and safety space, because even though it feels like we're in this big moment right now, and we are, right, where we're sort of like acknowledging all of these issues, you've been having these teams in the basement who have been talking about these problems for a very long time and trying to work with teams on the ground to add friction, right, in processes, in product, and justifying that by saying, okay, we may see right now a slight drop in like our user acquisition, but for retention in the long term, like this is the path that we should take, right? And I think that it's a very interesting moment that we are in now, where in a way, trust and safety can feel vindicated, and we're getting also like more, spotlight, right? And you see companies investing more because we are seeing effectively the fact that there is an impact even on the bottom line, right? Because customers, especially Gen Z, are voting with their feet and deciding to go to platforms that serve their personal needs better, right? Like we talked about authenticity, safety, all of that. And so I think platforms are realizing that there is effectively an interest, even an economic interest, to investing in safety, investing in measures that are going to protect users. And I think it's also something that when we think about the bottom line, we're thinking about like the ads business model, right? Now we have all kinds of organizations that are focused on brand safety, right? And advertisers are actually worried about where they're going to put their ad dollars, right? And what's going to show up next to their ads. And so that's another motivator, I think, for companies to also think deeply about, how are we investing in safety? How are we investing in privacy and all of these things, so that we do, in fact, like protect our business. And I think the other thing I will add is, at the end of the day, companies are going to optimize for what they can measure. And so I think the conversation about metrics is one that's very important. And as we've talked about today, like we are trying to define all these things, right? And once we've defined them, we need to understand how to measure them, right? And so I think it's going to take not just the companies, but like people in this room and everyone to help the companies understand, okay, what it is that we're trying to measure and how do we measure it so that in fact we can optimize towards that, right? So that it's not just optimizing towards the dollars, but also towards like these other things that we have criteria for and that we can measure progress against.
Can you talk about what some of those measurements might be?
I think that when we think about like specifically like safety, for example, it could be a lot of different things. I think being able to define like what safety means for the platform, right? So identifying like specific behaviors, and then allocating, like how are people, like what is our retention doing, right, in this specific space, right? When we put this measure in place, how does that impact people engaging on the platform? Why are they going to, like, are they going to other platforms? Why are they going there? So I think like talking to users and understanding like things such as like even retention, right? And the impacts of like safety on that, what could be one measure. There I think a ton of others as we define like different areas around like safety and privacy and inclusivity as well, and authenticity. But I think like these are spaces that we still have to find like variable criteria for, and that also makes sense for like each platform and the way they think about their own products, I guess.
Yeah, and just one more follow-up. Do you see a challenge in adapting for different cultural contexts? So I know that you've worked with French-speaking companies. I know that you've worked with a lot of US-based tech organizations. And so what counts as safety or comfort kind of differs across contexts and languages and access points. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that I tend to think of everything resorting to safety. So even when we talk about the conversation around like free expression, even when we talk about privacy, like different cultures are going to have like different representation of what that means for them. I think, for example, if you think about privacy in Europe, it's a very different concept than what we see here in the United States and how we want to protect that. And so I think it takes the work of companies to try to understand like those cultural differences and how to adapt. And I think that's a very difficult thing to do when you're trying to operate at scale and you're trying to operate with like policies or enforcement systems that are supposed to work with everyone. And so I think to a certain extent, like I think we're moving towards a world where we need to start thinking about like localizing more, right? And that is scary because that's also like a lot of resources that needs to be put in place to be able to do that effectively.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Are we at that? Okay. So just one big final question to wrap things up. What are, in your own work, what are some of the big challenges or one challenge you see and what needs to change moving forward? So we can start with Gabo and then come back here.
Well, I think we need to have more people create in these new technologies in Web3. It's just the same thing is happening of who's dominating. So I think that would solve a lot of these problems and make them much better if they're being designed and led by everyone and not just, you know, a kind of caricature of one type of person. So.
Definitely agree with that. And I'd say one of the big challenges that we see is also just the incentives that tech companies have. I think we've seen the challenge most recently around the primary focus being maximizing shareholder value. And now tech companies are experiencing this huge loss of their best talent and getting into wars on Twitter where billionaires are responding with poop emojis instead of engaging in like real important conversations about the future of these companies that really affect people's lives across the world. So I just think the incentives, like that boils down to not really caring about people and having incentives that aren't focused on the public good. And I think that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah, I think I have maybe a very practical challenge in mind. And it goes back to something I mentioned earlier around like, how do we define things? I come from like mostly an operational background, and in order to operationalize, we need to break down complex things into components and processes. And so, you know, we talked about like, what is our definition of a positive digital space? We all have a bit of a different definition, right? And so when you think about like how products are built today, right, we start with like this North Star, what we're trying to achieve, and then we sort of like work that back and create like product and break it down into specific components of the future, specific processes, specific policies, etc. And it's really hard to do when we don't have alignment on the North Star. Not only just like in this room, but also like, you know, across sectors, across geographies. And so I think that's one of the big challenges. And so I think the other thing is related to that is also, you know, we're seeing a lot of regulations right now coming, which is, I think, you know, very important. And also sometimes it's also the fact that like the operational aspect of how to make those real, implement them is not considered. And so personally, I would love to have a lot more collaboration between industry and government to be able to do that effectively. And that's going to take the companies opening up and being more transparent, right? And that's also going to take some education, right? You were referring to that. And so ultimately, I think it's going to take trust, right, between all sides. And I'll just mention an idea here because I heard it from someone recently, which I thought was really good, was that maybe we should think about some kind of public service program for tech workers, right, where they could go into government spaces, right? And we can discuss separately who's going to sponsor that, but so that we have more of this exchange of knowledge, right? And that on both sides, we can come up with solutions that are a lot more implementable for companies as well.
Love that. Okay, well, I just want to thank Dona, Joy, and Gabo again for sharing their time with us and their experiences. And I think that's a wrap. Thanks.
Thank you for that wonderful panel. I do think the future is friction. The future is also female. We can do two things at once.